When the Tide Comes Home, Part 2. The sky over Manila was the color of pewter when Luca's plane touched down. The monsoon had already begun its slow claiming of the season, light rain that blurred the glass, heat rising from the tarmac like memory. He carried little more than his sketchbook, a change of clothes, and the small envelope Nora had pressed into his hand before she boarded her flight back to Amsterdam. Inside was the grain of sand he'd given her, returned. So the tide can keep moving, she had written. He smiled when he read it again. In Delft, Nora found herself restless in the quiet of her apartment. The sound of trams outside, the smell of coffee and rain on the canals, everything she once loved now felt like a pause she hadn't earned. Her inbox overflowed with projects, proposals, data sets. Yet she couldn't stop thinking about the village Luca had described. How he spoke of wood that flexed and walls that breathed, how rebuilding had become another form of remembering. She opened her mother's old field journals, tracing the notes written in careful, looping script. Adaptive structures for coastal resilience, combined traditional techniques with modern design. Halfway through one page, Nora stopped. In the margin, her mother had drawn a sketch of stilt houses shaped like petals, wide at the top to let wind slip through. Beneath it, she'd written, San Isidro, pilot site approved. Nora's breath caught. She hadn't realized her mother had returned there after that first mission, after meeting Luca. The thought of the two of them standing in the same wind years apart made something inside her settle into clarity. She wrote a single line in her own notebook. Return where the tide began. And she booked a flight. Luca didn't know she was coming. When the jeepney from the city pulled into San Isidro, the air shimmered with heat and cicadas. The shoreline had changed again. New buildings, higher platforms, gardens blooming between the houses. Children chased each other barefoot through puddles. The smell of grilled fish and wet bamboo carried through the air. He was standing by the waterline, fixing a beam for a new community hall, when he saw her walking down the beach with a woven bag slung over her shoulder. For a moment he didn't move. The scene felt like something half-remembered from a dream, colors too sharp, time too slow. When she reached him, she smiled, a little breathless. You didn't tell me it was this beautiful, she said. He laughed, shaking his head. I didn't think you'd believe me. That night, the village held a small gathering to welcome her. Someone brought out a guitar, someone else a bottle of lambanog. The sea glimmered under a half moon, and laughter mixed with the tide. Nora sat beside Luca on the steps of the rebuilt pier. The air smelled of salt and smoke, her hair damp from humidity. She looked at the row of houses that stood on stilts above the sand, graceful, strong light catching on the curved eaves. They look like flowers, she said. They are, he replied. Your mother designed the first one. We just learned how to let them grow. Nora turned to him. You remember everything, don't you? Only what the sea won't let me forget. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Waves whispered against the pilings below. Somewhere, someone began to sing. In the days that followed, they worked side by side. Nora walked through the community with her tablet and her mother's notes, sketching improvements, solar panels on the roofs, new drainage systems that mimicked mangroves. Luca translated her ideas into structure and rhythm. His hands knew the wood better than any blueprint. Together they drew on both languages, the scientific and the human. When a storm warning came one afternoon, they stood on the bluff watching the horizon darken. It will pass, Luca said. It always does, Nora answered. He looked at her, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. My mother used to say that, he murmured. I know, she said softly. She taught us both how to listen. The first drops began to fall. They didn't move. The rain was warm, gentle, almost playful. Over the following weeks, their routines fell into a quiet rhythm. Mornings spent measuring, afternoons in the workshop, evenings walking along the beach where the surf left ribbons of foam like handwriting on the sand. They talked about her mother sometimes, about the storm, the rebuild, the years between, but more often they simply walked, comfortable in the spaces where words weren't needed. One night, as they sat near the shore watching the tide climb the sand, Nora asked, Did you ever think about leaving here? He smiled faintly. For a while, but every road led back to the water. Maybe that's the same for me, she said. Then the sea did remember you, he said. She looked at him in the dim light, and for the first time in years, she felt entirely home. When the NGO's director visited a month later, Nora presented their new design, a hybrid of her mother's prototypes and Luca's native carpentry. She called it the Elise House, though her voice trembled slightly when she said the name aloud. The director nodded. We'll fund 3 more pilot sites, she said. This could change the way coastal housing is built. After the meeting, Luca found Nora by the water, tracing circles in the sand with her foot. She'd be proud, he said. She'd tell us to keep testing wind angles, she replied, smiling. He laughed. Probably. The tide was pulling out, quiet and sure. Do you ever think, she said slowly, that maybe loss is just how the world teaches us to start again? He nodded. Maybe it's how the sea teaches us to build better. At sunset, they went to the edge of the pier again, where the first night's music had played. The sky flared gold and lavender, the water turning to glass. Nora took something from her pocket, a small glass jar, the same one he'd once given her, now holding a folded slip of paper. She opened it and read aloud, her voice steady. The sea always remembers, so must we. Then she placed the jar in the water, watching as the tide carried it slowly away. Luca reached for her hand. This time she didn't hesitate. In the months that followed, the Elise houses rose along the coast like quiet promises. Fishermen painted them in soft colors, coral, ochre, blue. Children played beneath them in the shade, their laughter carried by wind that no longer broke walls but passed through them. When visitors came to study the model, they would find Nora and Luca standing together, explaining not just the design but the story behind it, of storms and rebuilding, of a letter that survived, of tides that returned what was lost. Sometimes in the evenings, they would walk down the beach with the last light fading, and Nora would stop to watch the waves. They never stop, she'd say. They're not supposed to, he'd reply. Years later, long after their design had been adopted in other coasts and their names printed in papers, locals would still point to the pier at San Isidro and say that was where the tide came home. And on certain evenings, when the air turned gold and the sea lay calm, you could still see 2 figures standing there, side by side, not speaking, only watching the horizon breathe. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Come back for more stories weekly, and have a wonderful day.